They wheeled the mantel clock out of my own lounge while I was still holding a tray of sausage rolls for the memorial guests and my daughter-in-law, crisp blouse tucked into trousers that hadn't seen a supermarket queue in their life, smiled as if she were doing me a favor. The clock had chimed every hour of my marriage. The brass pendulum caught the light when Peter would say I'd made the roast too dry, then kiss my hair. That afternoon it scraped my hallway paintwork, bump by bump, past guests who lowered their eyes, because it is easier to pretend a thing isn't happening when tea is being poured. Mara lifted her glass and announced, "Mum has decided to downsize. It's all very positive. We're implementing the care plan we discussed." I opened my mouth to say I had discussed nothing, but Daniel squeezed my arm and whispered through his teeth, "We've got this. Just smile, Mum. People are watching." If someone had asked me a year earlier what would humiliate me, I might have told them it would be forgetting a word in public or smudging my lipstick. In reality, it was standing barefoot in my own kitchen, while movers wrapped my wedding china in brittle paper, and hearing Mara tell everyone I was fragile in the head, but thankfully, details were being handled. She held up a plastic folder, translucent blue, with a label, LPA plus deed. She liked initials, liked to make them sound like safety. My hands went cold though the kettle hissed. LPA meant lasting power of attorney. Peter and I had joked once about the paperwork people use as a polite broom to sweep old folks into corners. We never appointed one because he said, "We'll manage it together, May," and then he died, and suddenly people arrived with clipboards. I could smell lilies from the wreath on the sideboard. A fly kept butting the window, and I watched its tiny body buzz itself silly against the glass, because my mind would not stick to the present. People were talking about the photos I'd put out, Peter in his high-vis jacket, his hairline fleeing even in his 30s, Owen and Daniel as boys, legs like matchsticks on Scarborough Beach. Then my neighbor, Gina from number 5, set down the quiche she brought and leaned in close to me. She whispered, "I saw a van earlier, love, before the service, men with crates. Is this something you want?" I said, "Of course," and tasted bitterness, because the words sounded wrong in my mouth. She searched my face, didn't believe me, but nodded. She has a daughter who works at the bank, and I filed that thought away the way I file recipes, something that might save me later. Mara tapped her folder with a manicured fingernail and steered me to the table like I was a trolley. "Sign these, May. It'll reassure everyone you're on board. No pressure, of course." She smiled to let the room know she was kind. The top document had a notarial seal already pressed in the corner like a bruise. The words blurred and steadied, and I felt small in a way I hadn't since my first day in the textile mill at 16, when the machine noise swallowed my name. I said, "I'd like to read them." Mara's eyes slid to Daniel and then back to me, soft but glinting. "We're not monsters, you can read, but guests will be leaving and it would be nice to have clarity. Your GP agrees you've been under strain. Best to take these steps now before anything, degenerates." Her voice lowered on the last word as if it might stain the napkins. I was not brave in some shining way. I felt heat in my throat and the old fear loomed, becoming a burden, being the one who slows the queue, who needs the driver to nail the bus. After Peter's stroke, the fear sat behind my ribs like a lodger who didn't pay rent. I had learned to carry it quietly. I had worked the mill then a school canteen until my knees protested, saved small amounts in ISAs because my mother taught me to iron money with my palm before handing it over. I do not sparkle. My value is invisible like clean pillowcases. People sleep on it and wake up thinking comfort comes by itself. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and angled the screen away from me, a small movement that pinched my heart because he used to share everything with me, hacked Lego castles, teenage poems typed in all caps. He said, "It's just the conveyancer checking the time for Friday." Mara's head tilted. "Don't worry your mum with jargon, Dan. Friday is just formality. May, you won't have to move right away." We thought a month. I looked at them and tried to place this moment, whether it belonged to the memorial for my husband or a meeting I hadn't realized I'd been dragged into. I looked at the paper again, and there it was, the word gift, capital G, like a birthday. Gift of property to child to avoid probate complications, subject to a license to occupy. There was a sentence that made me swallow twice. Donor reserves a personal right of residence at the discretion of donee. Discretion. Such a pretty word for somebody else's thumb on your life. A small sound came from the hallway, a thunk and a muffled swear, and I saw the movers struggling with the wardrobe we brought from Peter's mother's house. One man wiped his brow with his sleeve, leaving a dark smear, and I said in a voice that surprised me, "Leave that." The man looked at Mara, not at me. She gave a shrug that could mean anything. They carried on. My fingers were slick when I reached for the pen. I don't know why I reached at all, perhaps to stop the room from tilting, perhaps to placate fear with ink. The pen was heavier than the ones I buy in packs of 10. It felt like a baton. Someone said, "She's lucky to have such a attentive family," and the old shame flushed my face, because luck is what people call a cage when they've never had to live inside it. Before the first stroke of my name, the doorbell rang. It was so ordinary a sound in that charged room that several guests jumped, as if the house itself had spoken. Gina moved quicker than I could and opened the door. On the step stood a man in a navy fleece with a logo I recognized, the union Peter paid into for 30 years. He held a cardboard envelope. His hair was thin and his smile awkward. "I'm looking for Mrs. May Fisher, is that right?" "That's me." He nodded, held out the envelope. "I'm from the Rail Workers Benevolent Fund. There's a small matter about a policy Mr. Fisher kept up. We wrote, but we prefer to deliver the first packet in person. A condolence and some forms, sorry for the timing." His eyes slid over the crowded hallway, the mover heaving my wardrobe, the lilies leaning like tired guests. Mara materialized between us. "I'm her attorney. You can give that to me." He glanced at me and I lifted my chin. "He can give it to me." He hesitated, then placed the envelope in my hands, and something settled inside me like a coin dropped into a jar. I tucked the envelope beneath the clock's absent place on the mantel, as if the house could keep it for me. Mara guided me back to the table. "As I said, just a signature, then we can focus on the lovely sandwiches you made. Imagine your stress melting away. The GP thinks it's best. She likes to borrow authority as if it's a dress she can change into. I wanted to say that stress does not melt. It thickens like gravy if the heat is high enough and someone keeps stirring." I took the pen again. I did not sign. Instead, I asked a small, silly question because I needed time. "Where did you get the notary seal?" She blinked. "Online booking. Mobile notarization. They came this morning while you were at the church. We organized to help you, May. It doesn't need to be a drama." Her lips shaped the last word like a warning. The man from the union had knocked a snowflake of dust from the doorframe, and it drifted down onto the carpet. I watched it fall and remembered a phrase Peter said more than once about trains: "If a screw is left loose, the whole carriage rattles." He meant marriage. He meant money. He meant we had to be precise. I thought of our blue folder, not translucent, thick plastic with a snap, the one we kept in the bottom drawer of the desk, the one we called later. Inside were insurance policies we never claimed because we were too proud or too tired to dig for them. One in particular had numbers scrawled on it by Peter, his ugly neat handwriting, a string of digits, and the word offset underlined twice. He had said without looking at me while stirring his tea, "Remember the blue one, love, if you need a lever." I hadn't asked what he meant because asking might have made the question real. After the guests left and the lilies sagged and the men promised to return in the morning for the rest, I hid in my bedroom, turned the envelope from the union over and over until the cardboard grew soft at the corners. Inside was a letter on stiff paper, a booklet, and a check with my name spelled correctly, the amount practical rather than grand. There was also a note from the fund's accountant apologizing for their delay and listing contact numbers. A sentence snagged me. "In addition to the standard benefit, Mr. Fisher retained an optional supplementary policy linked to his old offset mortgage account. We will need your bank details to disperse." The word offset glowed. I pulled the blue folder from the drawer like a magician producing a scarf, but there was only air. The folder was gone. I felt the absence like a hand to the chest. I searched the desk, then the cupboard, then the silly places, between towels, inside the slow cooker I only use at Christmas. Nothing. The later I had been told to remember had been emptied into someone else's pocket. In the living room, Daniel and Mara were loading plates into boxes rather than the dishwasher because they had decided movement itself would make their plan easier. I stood very still. Did you move a blue folder? Mara didn't look up. We tidied some clutter, yes. We're streamlining for you. I said, where is it? Daniel said, we'll find it. Don't fret. He said fret the way people say fret when they mean comply. I need it. My voice had the tight sound of a violin string turned too far. Mara finally looked at me and said gently, with the patience of a teacher to a slow child, if it were important, I would have it. Let us carry this for you. I boiled the kettle again because boiling kettles is what women in my street do when the world sours. I poured the water over a tea bag and watched color flood, then braided itself darker. I realized my hands had started to shake not because I felt weak, but because a thin string of anger had finally found somewhere to knot itself. I set the mug down. I'm not signing tonight. My voice surprised me because it did not wobble. Mara tilted her head and put down a stack of plates carefully, as if she might drop them to make a point. Of course. We'll have a quiet night and revisit with the solicitor on Friday. Her smile held. She doesn't like to be told no. She prefers to choreograph her yes and distribute them like treats. That night I did not sleep. Grief is odd. It opens a trapdoor to other rooms you didn't expect. I lay there hearing the house creak in old places, Peter's boots still under the bed where he left them before the hospital took him instead. I thought of the times I had laughed off small unkindnesses, the way Mara corrected my stories in front of the grandchildren, how Daniel stopped asking for my recipes because there are apps now. You water small fires to entertain guests, and then one day your sofa is ash. I got up, wrapped in my robe, and looked again for the folder. Gone is a blunt word. It leaves no handle. I made a list in my head, though I hate lists: who had been here, what had moved, what had been said. I stared at the mantel where the clock had lived and imagined the brass pendulum in a storage unit, silent. At 3 a.m. I decided I would not be worked like old cloth. If I must be a burden, I would choose where to be placed. There is a power in choosing even the shape of your consent. Peter's sentence about the lever thudded in my head. Offset. The word was not a comfort, but it was a direction. In the quiet, I opened the union booklet again and traced the phone numbers. I wrote them on the underside of the kitchen calendar in pencil so no one would photograph them easily. I slid the check under a tile that is loose by the back door, the one Peter always promised to fix. I did something I am not proud of. I took my late husband's toolbox from the shed and pried a small wooden strip loose from the wardrobe the movers had wanted. Inside, shallow and dusty, I found an envelope taped to the back panel. It had my name and Peter's handwriting. Inside were photocopies of bank statements and a letter addressed to our mortgage lender from 12 years ago. A sticky note said, "Blue folder is for show. This is the lever." I sat on the floor and cried, but not the soft kind. Crying is a poor word for what it is to let go of politeness. The letter explained with Peter's laborious carefulness that our mortgage had an offset savings component we'd overfunded slightly, and that as a condition for a rate reduction they'd given us an obscure right. If one of us died, the other could reassign the excess into a restricted term account protected from attorney power without our joint signatures. The clause was buried in paragraph 9, subsection C. My chest hurt with a feeling I could not name, relief, maybe, and fury braided together so tightly they were the same rope. At 8, Mara knocked and let herself in, because she does that. She wore perfume that smelled expensive and a smile that smelled like organization. Big day. Conveyancer at 10. Don't worry, we'll shepherd you through. She reached for the kettle like she owned the wrists attached to it. I placed Peter's letter on the table and covered it with the union booklet. I'll make the tea. She watched me as if cataloging a minor rebellious act. Daniel came down scratching his chest through his t-shirt, boyish suddenly, and for a second I saw the 8-year-old who cried when a classmate crushed his paper boat. Then he said, "You've had a sleep? You look less scattered." The casual cruelty of intended care. After breakfast, while they were distracted by a call with the conveyancer, I slipped out under pretense of taking the bins. Gina was in her front garden pinching dead heads off petunias with the precision of a surgeon. "You look like you need a secret, love," she said without lifting her eyes. I said, "Do you still have your Rosie at the bank?" Gina blinked, then nodded slowly, curious. "She's on the retail side, but she knows things, you know. You've got a face that says, 'Don't put this on Facebook.' Come in." In her kitchen, wallpapered with lemons, I told her enough to make my request simple and not drown us both. "I need to know if anyone accessed my accounts this month without my permission. I need to know if any standing orders moved." She pursed her lips. "You're asking me to ask my daughter to risk her job. That is not a small favor." I looked at my hands, the ridges where my rings used to sit before they were taken for safekeeping. I said, "I will owe you, Gina. And if I am wrong, I will bake for a year and never mention it again." She looked at my face a long time as if reading a faded recipe card. Then she sighed and picked up her phone. "Go home. Put on the kettle. Wait for a text." She winked for brightness. "And take those petunias by the path, they're pretending they don't need water." I walked back with a pot of flowers that felt like a disguise. Mara saw me and raised an eyebrow. "Morning wander? We need you sharp." She touched the blue folder, this new blue, translucent and obedient, and I thought of smashing something just to hear the noise. At 9:40, while I put out biscuits as if sweetness could grease our morning, my phone vibrated in my apron pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Savings I say, move to joint with D. Fisher August 2nd. New LPA registered August 5th. Standing order from offset account to Argus Advisory, £1,200 per M. Will call later R." I felt heat rush to my face. Joint. Argus Advisory. A name that smelled like official concern and empty air. The second buzz came with a second message. "FYI, someone attempted to add third-party mobile to your accounts 9/12 today. Blocked by in-branch rule." "You're welcome." I lifted my eyes and saw Mara watching me. She smiled without her eyes. "You're very quiet, May. Thoughts?" I tucked the phone back into my pocket, folded my hands like a lady in church, and said, "I've decided not to sign anything until I've spoken to my own solicitor." Daniel's mouth opened, closed. Mara's smile cracked and smoothed. "Of course, your choice. But do remember the GP note about executive function. A court might decide someone should help you if you resist help. We are trying to avoid unpleasantness. Think of the grandchildren." She says, "Think of the grandchildren the way some people say, or else." I looked at her, at the clean planes of her face that would not show that she thought I was in the way of a better kitchen. I said, "I will, always." We were interrupted by the letterbox snapping. A single thing slid through and landed on the mat. Daniel went to pick it up and frowned. "No stamp," he said. He brought it to me because he doesn't yet know that the person who controls a house controls everything in it. The paper was cheap and folded badly. I unfolded it and smelled cheap printer ink. 3 words were typed in large letters. "Don't sign Friday." Underneath, in pen, a smaller line. "Meet me 12:30 at the cafe near the surgery. Ask for the carrot cake. J." I stared at the J written with a flourish that tickled an old memory I could not catch. The room hummed. Mara held out her hand and I folded the paper once and slid it into my cardigan pocket instead. "Junk?" she said lightly. "Probably," I answered, and I smiled in a way she had not seen from me before, not even when I watched my sons become men. Because somewhere in the quiet city of Leeds, someone else knew my Friday, and in my pocket was a stranger's carrot cake and a letter from the man I buried, and in the wardrobe a lever, and in the bank a daughter with a risk in her hands. Mara tipped her head, measuring a shift she couldn't name. She doesn't like mysteries unless she has written them herself. I wiped my hands on a tea towel to keep them from shaking, pressed my palm against the outline of the note in my pocket, and looked at the clock that was no longer on my mantel. Its absence ticked louder than any sound. Mara reached for her folder again, Daniel reached for my arm again, and outside, a bin lorry ground its way down our street. I felt something uncoil in my spine in a way that was not girlish, not reckless, but old and exact, like a knot you finally find the end of. I looked up and said, "I think the kettle's boiled." And in the steam curling past Mara's face, I realized I was not going to let them write my ending for me. The notary arrived before 10 with a rolling case and a careful smile that said she was used to walking into strained rooms and leaving with signatures that solved other people's plans. She introduced herself to me first, and that small courtesy eased my shoulders a fraction until Mara latched onto her like a host greeting a DJ at a wedding, ushering her to the table where she had already arranged the papers in a neat stack with sticky tabs. The woman glanced at the tabs and then at me with a question in her eyes that I could read, because I have fed many professionals tea while they explained complicated things to people who only wanted the bottom line. I poured her a cup and set it near her right hand and said I would like to read the documents at my own pace and in my own order. And she nodded slowly and said that was fine, and that nobody signs anything without understanding, and that she needed to see my original identification before she could witness anything, and that if I wished to seek independent advice, she would prefer to step back. Until that had happened. Mara smiled and said this was merely formalizing what had been agreed as a family, and that she had already arranged for the conveyancer to slot us in on Friday, and that the right to occupy would be respected because they are not unkind people. The notary's eyes moved again from her to me, and she said she works for me in this moment, not for the family. And that if there was even a hint of unease, she would recommend a cooling period and possibly a medical assessment of capacity if anyone raised a concern. Mara said the GP had already provided a letter and that we should not complicate matters with delays that would increase my stress. I placed my passport on the table and said I would not be signing today and that I would be seeking independent advice before Friday, which made Daniel blow out his breath in a soft, impatient sound that reminded me of his teenage years when he wanted a lift after midnight and did not care that my alarm went off at 6 for the canteen. The notary packed her stamp without using it and left her card near my teacup and wrote a note on it with a mobile number that was not on the printed side and slid it toward me with the motion of a person who understands that some conversations happen out of view. After she left, the temperature in the house changed in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Mara kept her tone light and began clearing cups as if tidying would smooth the morning into the shape she wanted, and Daniel checked the time and said they would take me to the surgery for my blood pressure check and then pop into the building society to pick up a certified copy of the already registered power of attorney so Friday would go through without delays. I said I had my own errands and could walk to the surgery because it is 8 minutes from the house and my legs still do what they are asked if I respect them. Mara said that was unwise because stress can lead to falls and that we did not need a scene in the street. She placed a clear plastic pill box on the table with days of the week written in white and said she had sorted my tablets because the GP had mentioned I had mixed doses once. I looked at the box and felt a small steady anger move through me because I have been sorting my own tablets since I was 30 and I know the difference between morning and evening without a plastic reminder. I pushed the box back gently and thanked her for the thought and said I would continue using the packets the way I always do because the pharmacist brings them in blister strips and it is not complicated. The first small blow came at the surgery where the receptionist who has watched me queue with my repeat prescription for years lowered her voice and asked if my daughter-in-law should come in with me to help with forms because she had been told I was having a tough time with details. I said I was fine to speak alone, and she looked uncertain and glanced at Mara, who had positioned herself near the desk with a soft smile and a binder. When the nurse called me in, Mara rose to come with us, and I stopped just short of the doorway and said I wanted privacy. The nurse looked from my face to Mara's and made her own quiet decision and told Mara there was no clinical need for her to be present and closed the door. She wrapped the cuff around my arm and asked if things were manageable at home and whether I felt safe and whether any money decisions were being made under pressure. And I heard the careful training in her wording, and I also heard the news traveling ahead of me like a leaflet pushed through doors. I answered what I could and not more than I needed because these rooms can carry stories that are hard to retract later. After the reading, which was higher than usual because I am not a statue, she asked if I would like a call from the social prescriber who can signpost people to advice about legal matters and housing worries and family conflict. I said yes, because there is no harm in collecting names, and she tapped something into the computer and nodded as if she had passed me a bag of groceries I would need in a day or two. When we came out, Mara had arranged her face into careful concern, and Daniel was tapping a message into the family group chat whose name I hate because it is cheerful in a way that ignores the real weather in a house. My screen buzzed and a stream of messages appeared that looked like support to someone reading with half an eye and looked like pressure to me because they all carried the same script about how blessed I was to have a daughter-in-law stepping up and how it would be wise not to complicate something that could keep me safe, and how nobody wants difficult decisions made by strangers, and how it would break the grandchildren if I refused help and then something went wrong that could have been avoided. My sister-in-law Irene added a voice note about her friend who had refused to sign a power of attorney and then fallen for a scam and lost her savings. And that nice bank manager had told them if they had attached a registered LPA earlier, the bank could have stopped it. Mara wrote a warm message thanking everyone for their kindness and saying she was doing her best to protect me and asking people to keep their views calm because stress is not good for my health. The tone made me feel trapped in a soft web that would look like love on a printed page. I typed nothing because silence can be a tool when people are piling words on you to make you move. At the building society, the woman at the counter asked Daniel to step back and then asked me directly to confirm whether I wanted anyone added as a signatory and whether I wanted to accept a new contact number ending in digits I did not recognize. I said no to both and asked whether there had been any attempts on my accounts that morning, and she looked at her screen and said there had been, and that the system had flagged it because the person could not answer a security question about the odd deposit I set up years ago to catch snoops. I smiled at that quietly and asked to add another question to my profile, something that would be hard for anyone to learn without asking me directly. She suggested my first pet, and I said that was a poor question because everyone in my family knows about Tinker the cat, and we settled on the name of my first supervisor at the mill because I have never told that story at a table. Daniel waited in the lobby with a tight face and pretended to read a poster about savings goals. On the way out, Mara placed a hand in the hollow of my back and said we were only trying to dodge the slow grind of bureaucracy that comes when someone reports a vulnerable adult, and that she would hate to see me have to prove my capacity to a stranger in an office because I refused a bit of help. I asked whether someone had reported me already, and she said she could not possibly know, but people sometimes get nervous when they see an older woman alone with financial paperwork after a bereavement and call the number on the poster because they think they are doing the right thing. I could almost hear the words composing themselves in the email drafts of people who do not understand that concern can be a knife if placed into the right hands. At noon, while Daniel went to collect the car because he did not want me walking, my phone buzzed with a call from a withheld number, and a woman introduced herself as calling from the office of the public guardian about a registration application made earlier in the month. She asked to confirm my address and date of birth and whether I was aware that an application had been made to register a lasting power of attorney appointing my son and his wife as my attorneys for property and finance. I said I had not signed an LPA and that I did not consent to any such registration and that I wished to lodge an objection because I had capacity and because I had concerns about the applicant's conduct with my accounts. The woman's tone shifted and became more formal, and she said she would send me the forms to object and that I should obtain a capacity assessment from my GP or an independent assessor to support the objection, and that if I received any pressure to sign documents I should contact them or the police because undue influence is a serious matter. She gave me a reference number and said the application would be paused pending review. Mara watched my face while I wrote down the number and asked with her mouth rather than her voice who I was speaking to, and I smiled in a way that covered the slip of paper with my hand and thanked the woman and ended the call. Daniel pulled up then, and I climbed into the car slowly because I wanted them to feel every second of the delay and because I needed those seconds to prevent my anger from turning into something that would blow up my plan. At home, a large white envelope from Argus Advisory waited on the mat with a welcome letter that thanked me for entrusting my future to their expert hands, and a brochure about care planning solutions, and a direct debit mandate for the standing order that had already started leaving my offset account. The letter said a preliminary assessment had been booked for Monday at 11 with their senior case coordinator at my address to discuss home adaptation and possible placement options in the medium term, and reminded me that deposits for reputable homes move quickly and that families who act decisively avoid disappointment. There was a paragraph about how families sometimes misinterpret firm guidance as pressure and how these misunderstandings delay safety. The small print listed an address in a business park and a company number that rang no bell, and the email signature belonged to a man whose surname I recognized as the maiden name of Mara's cousin. A cold knowledge settled in my stomach that this company was the bucket into which my money would be poured before rolling toward costs I had not chosen, and that someone I had eaten roast potatoes with at Christmas had turned her family tree into a pipeline for my savings. I looked up at Mara, and she did not blush, and she did not look away, and she said they had taken advice from professionals because they wanted to avoid mistakes, and that sometimes older people leave decisions too late, and then families have to pick up the mess, and that she did not want that for me or for Daniel or for the children who would be asked questions at school if something went wrong and the head teacher called a meeting. Her voice remained even and she kept her spine straight, and I realized that her need for control is the engine of her days, and that my resistance is a wrench in her gears. I am not a machine for anyone, but I have learned the rhythm of people who live by schedules and checklists and how to stall them without being caught. In the afternoon, the social prescriber called from the surgery and spoke in a warm, steady tone about options and free advice and support groups for people facing family pressure about finances and housing. She mentioned a local solicitor who offers half-hour consultations for older residents and suggested I call immediately because the week fills fast and because documents were already moving. She also mentioned a rule I had not known in clear words, that gifts of a property made shortly before a person requires care can be treated by the council as deliberate deprivation of assets, and that the council can still assess as if the person owned the asset and require contributions accordingly, which undermines the stated excuse families often use to rush a transfer to avoid care fees. She said this gently and left space in the call for me to breathe. I asked her to text me the solicitor's name, and she said she would, and she did, and I saved it under a name that would not excite attention if Mara looked at my phone, choosing Daisy Cakes, because it sounds like a cafe Gina likes. When we ended the call, Mara asked who that was, and I said it was the surgery checking satisfaction after the appointment because they like feedback, and she laughed and said public services love surveys, and then she looked at my phone screen and her face went still for a second because she saw the contact and could not read its meaning. I walked into the garden and watered Gina's petunias at the edge of my path and counted 20 to keep my hands from shaking. The day stretched and the strain gathered in my shoulders, and I kept moving because sitting would let the tension pool in one place and crack something I still needed. Daniel took a call with the conveyancer in the dining room, and I heard the words exchange of contracts and Friday 4 o'clock and 2 witnesses lined up and license to occupy and gift with reservation. I stepped into the doorway and asked for the draft deed and the license document to be emailed to me because I do not sign a recipe without reading the ingredients, and if anyone brings me something with hidden spice, I will taste it alone before setting it on a table. He said of course and gave Mara a glance that passed like a note in a classroom, and she typed my email address into her phone slowly while I watched her nails, but not her eyes. The documents arrived within minutes, and the license to occupy contained a clause that gave them a right to review and revoke the license if my presence caused stress to the household or impeded the enjoyment of the property by the new owners, or if I failed to comply with reasonable house rules to be agreed later. There was no timeline stated and no appeal process beyond a vague reference to reasonableness. The deed of gift stated the transfer would be for nil consideration in recognition of love and affection and in acknowledgement of the care and support provided by the donees to the donor. I read those lines twice and felt my jaw tighten at the use of words that polish something until it looks like a present when in fact it is a loss dressed up as generosity. I forwarded both documents to the email on the notary's card and wrote 2 questions about the license, and one about capacity, and a final one about whether she had any connection with Argus Advisory, because I believe in documenting connections in writing, where possible, since people like to forget later what they implied in a room. Family pressure doubled in the early evening when Daniel's brother Owen called from Bristol and filled the speaker with the sound of children arguing over a tablet and a tone that suggested he had been briefed in a hurry. He said he could not come up for Friday because of work and that he trusted Daniel to deal with things and that Mara was very organized and that he had no view on legal jargon and that as long as I did not end up in a bad home, he would back whatever plan. Avoided fuss. He thanked them for stepping up for me and said he hoped I appreciated everything being done on my behalf because many families barely speak to each other, and it is lucky to have helpful people. I sat on the sofa and listened to my sons negotiate my life in phrases that sound reasonable when you are the one holding the calendar. When Owen rang off, Daniel turned to me and said it would break his heart to see me dragged through court by strangers just because I wanted to prove a point about independence. And Mara added quietly that if I refused a simple deed that would give them the ability to manage my house and safety, then the council might look into whether I can still make decisions, and then everything would be slower and colder and out of their hands. I heard the last part and understood the threat embedded in the language of concern. At 7:30, Gina knocked with a casserole because she follows rules that help people survive and because she needed a reason to step over my threshold. She waited until Mara went to answer a message and Daniel stepped into the garden to take a call and then told me Rosie had phoned her from a pay-as-you-go mobile she keeps for private things and said the Argus standing order had been set up from a branch where a friend had seen Mara with a woman who works at that branch after hours and that the branch had been told this was a confidential safety plan and that the customer had consented because a registered LPA was in play and that this combination can disarm ordinary checks because nobody wants to be the person who blocks care for an older woman after a bereavement. Gina also said Rosie had done a quick check on company's house in her lunch break and that Argus Advisory shares a director with a property sourcing company that lists Daniel as a consultant in a promotional video from last year that is still cached even though the main site has been cleaned up. I felt the room tilt slightly because that piece mattered more than any speech about safety. Gina pressed a folded paper into my hand with the details Rosie had scribbled between customers and told me to keep it in a place where Mara would not look. And then she lifted the foil on the casserole and made a fuss about seasoning in a way that covered the hush of our real exchange. Mara thanked her and said neighbors who show up with food are the backbone of a street, and Gina gave her a smile that could be read two ways and left. I sat with my plate and ate because bodies cannot run on air and because the smell of tomatoes and garlic made my stomach remember that it exists. Daniel put a stack of mail on the coffee table that he had collected from the mat, and halfway through the pile I found a brown window envelope from the bank with a red stripe that means priority, and inside was a letter that used very plain language for once. It said that a third party had notified the bank that I might be at risk of financial abuse and that in response the bank had placed a temporary safeguard on certain transactions and would require me to attend in person with identification to confirm my wishes regarding changes to accounts, and that if I did not attend within 72 hours they might restrict online access and freeze transfers while they conducted a further review. It also said they had logged an attempt to change my mobile number that morning and had blocked it, and that they wished to remind me that banks never pressure customers to make immediate decisions about powers of attorney and that I could request a vulnerable customer specialist to support me. At the bottom there was a direct phone number and a line about the possibility of involving the police if I felt I was under pressure to sign documents. I folded the letter and felt both relief and fear because this protection could also be used to present me as fragile, and because I knew who had filed the third-party report to trigger the bank's caution. Mara read over my shoulder and made a light sound as if swatting a fly and said you cannot even breathe without someone turning it into a case file these days, and that she would take me in the morning to clear it up, and that it is better to have these things visible than let small problems grow in the dark. I told her I would go alone and she said that would look odd given the timing, and I said I did not care how it would look, and she sat very still and then said in a polite tone that if I insisted on turning this into an issue she would have no choice but to seek advice from adult social care because she could not carry responsibility without authority, and that she would regret that because once the council steps in the family loses control, and nobody wants that. It was close to 9 when my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number that I knew belonged to the notary because the digits matched the ones she had written under her name. It said that the license to occupy clause was unusually broad and that she would not witness the deed unless an independent solicitor advised me and confirmed in writing that I understood the effect and that the reference to a GP letter about stress did not serve as a capacity assessment and that she would not accept it as justification to proceed in haste. It also said she had no link to Argus Advisory and had never heard of them, and that if I wished she could recommend a colleague to review the documents tomorrow morning at his office near the market. I read it twice and put the phone down and kept my face calm while a loud relief moved through my body in a way that could have knocked plates from shelves if I had let it out. We watched the local news without seeing it because we were all listening to the quiet noise that rises in a family when something important is about to happen and no one can keep their hands still. Mara took a call in the hallway and spoke in a whisper that carried through the thin door to my ears, telling someone that Friday needed to hold because the decorator was lined up for Monday and that the agency had a buyer interested in a quick flip if the title was clean and that she would handle the mother-in-law because she always does. Daniel sat on the arm of the sofa and rubbed his face and said he was sorry this felt so heavy and that he had not wanted to do any of it while Dad was barely in the ground, but that money had a timetable and that sometimes doing the right thing looked messy before it looked clean. I said I knew grief does not pause the council tax or the gas bill, and that I also knew the difference between help and control, and that he should decide which one he prefers to hand to his children as an example. He stared at the carpet and then at me and his eyes filled, and he held them there because he knew crying would be used against me later as proof that I was confusing him. And he said he loved me and that he wanted to help and that he did not know how to get out of the path of a woman who plans the week to fit her purpose. He lowered his voice and said that if I had an alternative, he would back me as long as it did not end with him losing his home, which told me what I already knew, that he had put something at risk on the promise of Friday. At 9:30, there was a knock that sounded official and Daniel opened the door to a courier with a digital pad who asked for my name and handed me a thick envelope from the council with a leaflet about adult safeguarding and a letter saying they had received a concern from a member of the public and would like to arrange a visit to discuss my circumstances and that failure to engage might lead to further steps, and a second envelope from the estate agent that Mara had used when she sold her friend's flat last year containing forms for a valuation appointment scheduled for Monday morning along with a glossy brochure about maximizing sale price and a note that made my stomach clench because it referred to my home by a new phrase, the property at your disposal, and named Daniel as the point of contact. I realized then that whatever happened on Friday had been laid out like a train timetable and that I was expected to stand on the platform and watch my life leave because someone else had booked the seats. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the dark of my small bedroom, the ticking of the clock loud enough to make my nerves twitch. My daughter-in-law's words and my son's silence kept replaying in my mind until the anger started to outweigh the shame. I had always told myself that mothers endure for the sake of peace, that keeping quiet was better than creating conflict, but lying in that bed I understood that my silence had been their weapon. If I continued to let them dictate my place in this family, I would eventually end up with nothing, erased from the home I had built and the life I had given everything to. By morning, the decision was made. I dressed carefully, not for them but for myself. A pressed blouse, my old coat, shoes that still held their shine from years of careful polishing. I looked in the mirror and forced myself to hold my own gaze. The woman staring back at me wasn't weak, not anymore. I gathered the documents I had tucked away in an envelope, bank statements, copies of the property deed, the notarized will my husband had updated before he passed. For months I had ignored those papers, too overwhelmed to read them, too tired to think about what they meant. Now, they were my armor. The first step was quiet. I went to the notary's office, a man who had known my husband for years. His eyebrows rose when I laid out the envelope. He read slowly, lips pressed tight, then looked up at me with something like pity mixed with respect. "You do realize," he said carefully, "that what they've been telling you is not only cruel but legally baseless. You are the sole owner of the property. Unless you willingly sign it away, no one can force you out." His words hit me like a rush of air after drowning. For the first time in months, I felt the ground under my feet. But with clarity came another truth. If they were willing to humiliate me so openly, they would not hesitate to trick me into signing something I didn't fully understand. I asked the notary about power of attorney, about gift contracts, about the kinds of documents people use to rob the elderly under the guise of help. He explained each one, showing me examples, teaching me where people make mistakes. I listened like my life depended on it, because in a way it did. By the time I left his office, my notebook was full of notes, and my fear had hardened into strategy. I started watching them differently. Every dinner, every conversation, I paid attention to the way my daughter-in-law spoke, the pauses in my son's voice, the documents they left carelessly on the counter. One evening, I saw an envelope addressed from the bank on the hall table. My daughter-in-law quickly snatched it up when she noticed my eyes on it, too quickly. That was when I understood. They weren't just waiting for me to make a mistake. They were already in trouble, and my home was their lifeline. The pressure escalated. My daughter-in-law began leaving brochures for senior communities on my bed, on the kitchen counter, slipped between the pages of the newspaper. My son repeated the same lines with a dull monotony, as if rehearsed. "It's safer for you, Mom. Less responsibility. We'll take care of the apartment while you adjust." Each word was a knife twisted with a smile. But I nodded, pretended to agree, even asked a few questions about the places they mentioned. I wanted them to think I was bending, that I would eventually give in. At night, though, I was planning. I went to the bank, updated my accounts, and placed limits on access. I moved part of my savings into a separate account they knew nothing about. I visited a lawyer, an older woman recommended by a neighbor, and gave her copies of every document I owned. She listened carefully, then leaned forward and said in a calm but firm voice, "If they try anything, you'll be ready. And when the time comes, we'll not only protect you, we'll expose them." Still, every step forward came with a new blow. One afternoon, I came back from errands to find my bedroom door half open, though I always locked it. My papers had been moved, the envelope no longer in the same place. Nothing was missing, but I knew someone had been inside. At dinner that night, my daughter-in-law kept smiling too much, and my son's eyes flickered nervously whenever I spoke. They had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough to suspect I was no longer the docile woman they had counted on. I didn't confront them. I simply poured tea, kept my hands steady, and spoke about ordinary things, though my heart pounded hard enough to hurt. But inside I knew, the game had shifted. They were watching me as closely as I was watching them. And then came the moment that confirmed my fears. A letter from the bank arrived in the mail, addressed to me but already opened. The flap had been clumsily resealed, as if someone had rushed. Inside was a notification about changes to my account that I had not requested. My hands shook as I read the words, but not from weakness. This was no longer about humiliation. This was theft in slow motion. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When I looked up, my daughter-in-law was standing in the doorway, watching me with that polite little smile she always wore when she thought she had one. That was the night I knew the battle had truly begun. Friday began like a test I had revised for in secret. I left before either of them came downstairs, the union envelope in my handbag, along with Peter's letter about the offset clause and the notary's card with her handwritten mobile. At the bank, the doors slid open at 9 and the manager, a woman I knew by sight from years of queuing, took me into a small glass room when I showed her the urgent freeze notice and my passport. I placed Peter's letter on the table and told her I wished to exercise the reassignment right under the offset clause he secured 12 years ago, and that I wanted the excess moved into the restricted term account named in the letter, ring-fenced from any attorney instruction until expiry, and that I wished to cancel a standing order to Argus Advisory set up without my knowledge. She read the letter, called a colleague, and then dialed compliance on speaker so I could hear each step. When compliance asked whether any attorney instructions were in place, I gave the office of the public guardian reference number and stated that I had lodged a formal objection to registration and requested a capacity assessment. The manager's tone shifted. Within minutes, she had the Argus order canceled, the attempted mobile change annotated as suspicious, and she printed a confirmation of the reassignment with a transaction time stamped at 9:37. She also typed a short note on bank letterhead stating that any transfer instructions from attorneys were paused, that I had attended in person, and that the offset funds were now held in a product that required my sole authority for withdrawal. I slipped the note into a plastic sleeve and breathed in a way that steadied my hands without announcing victory. At 12:30, I walked into the cafe near the surgery and asked for the carrot cake. The girl behind the counter gave me a quick assessing look and pointed to a table by the window where a woman in a navy cardigan was waiting with a tote bag on the floor. She stood when I approached and introduced herself as Janine from the surgery reception. Her eyes were clear and direct. I shouldn't put myself in the middle, but I watched what happened with the letter your daughter-in-law pushed for, and I couldn't ignore it. She slid a printout across the table, an email from the GP to Janine summarizing that the letter about stress was not a capacity assessment and must not be used to justify legal decisions, along with a copy of the practice's safeguarding policy about undue influence. Yesterday, she phoned twice asking whether the GP would reissue the note with different wording and mentioned an appointment at a conveyancer. We documented the calls. If anyone tries to use our letter to overrule your choices, ask them to read this line. She tapped the sentence that stated competence must be assumed unless a qualified assessor finds otherwise. She added something soft but firm. If you want me to put those calls into a safeguarding referral, I will, but that brings social care into it, and they do things by their own timetable. I thanked her and told her I had what I needed for today. She pressed a second envelope into my hand. A colleague at the practice lives near the branch where that Argus order appeared. She heard about an after-hours appointment with a staffer and a woman matching your daughter-in-law's description. She wrote down the time. It may help if it comes to it. I tucked the envelope away and felt the tight place behind my ribs loosen as if a screw had been turned the right way. At 2, I took the bus to the market and went up a narrow stair to the office the notary had recommended. The solicitor, a gray-haired man with a quiet voice, had already printed the deed of gift and the license to occupy from the emails I'd forwarded. He drew a square around the revocation clause in the license and another around a paragraph that would allow them to impose reasonable house rules later without naming them now. This is the sort of drafting that tells you more by what it omits, he said, and then asked me how the Argus payments had begun. I gave him the company's house notes Gina had passed from Rosie about the director overlap and Daniel's appearance in a property sourcing promo. He raised his eyebrows and said it created a conflict of interest any court would frown at. He printed a short letter on his headed paper addressed to the conveyancer stating that he advised me not to sign, that the license was unacceptably vague and capable of abuse, and that any transfer would likely be treated as deliberate deprivation should care be needed, defeating the incentive they were claiming. He also printed a second letter addressed to the estate agent advising them to cease all preparations to list my home as there was no valid authority. He asked if I wanted him present at 4. I said yes. By the time I walked back to the house for the 3:30 pickup, Daniel was pacing the hall with his phone at his ear while Mara stood in the doorway with her bag already zipped as if a border check awaited us. You left early, she said with a smile that wanted to control the temperature. We were worried. I told her I had been to the bank and would be bringing my own solicitor to the appointment. Daniel's jaw tightened. That complicates it. The conveyancer has a slot and the witnesses are arranged. Mara added, almost kindly, it's only a formality, May. We promised the decorator Monday. Think of how nice it will be for you to move somewhere smaller without stairs. I picked up my coat and passed her the notary's text printout and the solicitor's letter. Your notary won't witness. My solicitor will be there. And the bank has paused any attorney instructions pending review. Her smile stayed where it was, but something sharpened in her eyes. We arrived at the conveyancer at 5 minutes to 4. The waiting area was half full and smelled of toner. The conveyancer, a brisk woman in a black dress, led us into a conference room with a long table. 2 clerks sat at the end with the deed and license laid out, sticky flags applied. The notary was not there, but my solicitor was, sleeves rolled up as if to make clear he was working for me alone. Gina slid into a chair at the back, pretending to study a flyer. I had asked her to come, and she had brought someone with her who hung back near the doorway. a young woman with a bank lanyard tucked into her cardigan. My heart banged once, then settled. Rosie had come on her break. The conveyancer began without looking at me. "We're here to formalize the gift of the property to your son, with a license to occupy to protect your continued residence, and we have the GP's note confirming the stress, which provides a good clinical context for acting promptly." My solicitor coughed. "That is not a capacity assessment and must not be put forward as such." He placed the practice email Janine had given me on the table. The conveyancer glanced at it and changed her tone a half step. "Of course. The note is not capacity, it's context." She looked at me at last. "Mrs. Fisher, do you understand that by signing the deed you will cease to be the legal owner of your home?" I said I did, and then I said I would not be signing anything today or later because the license was a blank check for my eviction. The room tightened. Mara leaned forward with what she meant to sound like patience. "No one intends to evict you. We're trying to put structure in place so the house doesn't get stuck in probate when the time comes." My solicitor slid the deprivation of assets printout across to her. "Your expressed aim to avoid care assessments through transfer is noted. The council would treat this as deprivation, and you would gain nothing while exposing yourselves to allegations of financial abuse." Daniel flushed and said he hated that phrase. The conveyancer raised a manicured hand. "Perhaps we could simply witness the deed and revisit the license wording." The notary. She faltered when she realized the notary was absent, and my solicitor's letter naming her refusal sat on the table. I took the bank manager's letter from my plastic sleeve and placed it next to the deed so the timestamp was visible. At 9:37, I reassigned the offset excess to a restricted term account under a clause my husband negotiated. Any standing order to Argus advisory has been canceled and any attorney instruction paused pending OPG review. The conveyancer looked from the paper to my face, recalculating. Mara let a soft laugh out. "Nobody is stealing from you. Argus is a reputable firm." She reached into her bag and put a glossy brochure down like a proof of care. Gina stood then and introduced Rosie. "This is my daughter from the bank. She has 10 minutes as she's on her lunch." Rosie cleared her throat and spoke without looking at Mara. "We cannot discuss a customer's accounts in a public room, so I won't. But I can confirm that last week an after-hours appointment occurred at our branch with a staff member who is now under internal investigation for facilitating a standing order to a third-party advisory company using a not-yet-registered power of attorney and a GP letter as context." She looked at me instead. "The bank treats this pattern as a safeguarding concern." She took a folded printout from her pocket. The appointment time was 18:42. She placed it on the table and stepped back. The conveyancer stiffened as if she had touched a live wire. Mara's mouth opened and closed. Her practiced smile wavered in a way that showed how much of it was muscle memory. My solicitor laid the company's house sheets down next, pointing to the shared director between Argus Advisory and the property sourcing company and the promotional video showing Daniel as a consultant. He spoke evenly. "A transfer today would move a valuable asset away from the donor and into the hands of a donee who is already linked to a company being paid from her accounts without valid authority. That combination raises conflicts of interest and possible fraud." Daniel put both palms flat on the table, color washing his face. "That video is old. I did one job for them last year and never got paid. It has nothing to do with Argus." My solicitor nodded once. "Then you will have no objection to a written undertaking not to benefit, directly or indirectly, from any payments made by the donor to any company connected to these directors." Daniel swallowed and glanced at Mara. She kept her eyes on the papers. I took out the envelope from the union and placed the letter and the check on the stack. In addition to our standard benefit, Peter kept up a supplementary policy tied to our old offset mortgage. The fund has confirmed a disbursement that will go only to me on receipt of my details. The Argus line about deposits moving quickly is now irrelevant to any claim that I need to transfer my home for safety. The conveyancer stared at the check as if it had embarrassed her timetable. A knock sounded and a woman in a navy blazer stepped in, badge on a lanyard. "Adult Social Care," she said, introducing herself by name. "I rang and you asked me to come today, Mrs. Fisher." I had called her at noon with the direct number from the bank's letter and told her I wanted my objection on record. She glanced at the papers, then at me. We prefer families to sort things softly, but when we see arrangements that could place an older adult at risk, we step in. She turned to Mara and Daniel. Any transfer of the property at this point would be viewed in our assessment for deliberate deprivation and would not assist you in avoiding contributions if care becomes necessary. It could, however, lead us to explore whether a safeguarding plan is needed. Mara lifted her chin and spoke softly. We are trying to protect her. The officer answered in the same tone. Protection doesn't begin with a deed and a brochure. Silence stretched then broke when the conveyancer tried a last pivot. Perhaps we could still proceed with placing a restriction or a declaration of trust to reassure the family. My solicitor shook his head. There will be no transaction today. He placed his final letter on the table, addressed to the conveyancer, formally revoking any informal authority and instructing that no further attempts be made to arrange a transfer without direct contact with him and the OPG reference. He looked to me and I nodded. He added calmly, and we will be writing to Argus's directors today concerning the unauthorized standing order. Mara leaned back, watching the scaffolding she built tilt. Her voice, when it came, was lower. If you refuse help, the court can appoint a deputy. That is not a threat, it is a fact. You will not enjoy strangers running your life. I slid Janine's email forward again with its line about presuming capacity and documenting undue influence. Then I did the thing that turned the whole scene. If you believe I am a burden who cannot manage a house, then I agree to be assessed officially and to have any transfer treated as deprivation, so nobody can use my supposed needs to justify taking my asset. I will be whatever burden the law says I am on paper with every safeguard. But I will not be your burden with your conditions and your revocable license. The adult social care officer nodded once, understanding the pivot. That choice sits with her, she said to the room. If anything proceeds, it will be on our terms, not yours. The true blow arrived from a corner none of us were looking at. The door opened again and a young clerk in the conveyancer's firm stepped in, cheeks flushed, a file in his hands. He looked at his boss and then at me. You asked me to check the file histories for this matter, he said in a voice that wanted to be steady. The notary stamp was applied to a copy of the deed yesterday morning at 8:22 in this office, but there is no client signature on that copy, and the scan log shows it was emailed to a private address at 8:31 with the subject line, "Looks official enough." He trailed off, eyes on the carpet. The conveyancer's face went flat, anger and embarrassment fighting under her professional calm. My solicitor spoke very quietly. That email will be produced if asked. The clerk swallowed and nodded. I've already backed it up to the firm server. Daniel found his voice first and directed it at Mara. What have you sent, and to whom? His voice had that raw edge a child has when a parent disappoints him in front of school. Mara stared at the clerk and then at me. You have turned people against us, she said, but the heat had gone from her words. I sat there with my hands on the table and my house behind my back like a person who has chosen where to stand and has no intention of moving. My solicitor gathered the documents and slid them into his case. We're finished here, he said to the conveyancer. Any further contact should come through me. The adult social care officer nodded to me and said she would follow up next week to arrange the capacity assessment I had consented to, then handed Mara her card. If you attempt to move forward without clear consent, you will be speaking to my team. Rosie whispered a goodbye and slipped out. Gina stood, squeezed my shoulder, and went to the door, pausing to look Daniel in the eye with the kind of look a neighbor uses when a boy who once kicked his ball into her petunias tries the same trick as a man. We had almost reached the corridor when a voice called my name. The union man who had delivered the envelope at the memorial stepped into the room with a cardboard file and an apology on his face. I'm late, he said, but I thought you might need this for any nosy parties. He placed on the table a letter confirming the existence and terms of the supplementary policy and the conditions that prevented any attorney from altering its beneficiary or redirection. He nodded, touched the brim of an imaginary cap, and left as if he had simply delivered a parcel to the wrong door and corrected his route. We stepped into the corridor and the conveyancer followed, looking older and a little smaller than when we arrived. Mrs. Fisher, she said in a low voice, I should have slowed this down the moment I saw the license wording. That's on me. I said nothing because forgiveness is not a legal instrument, and I was using legal tools today. On the pavement outside, the air felt raw and ordinary. Daniel came out after us and stopped in front of me without quite meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I told myself this would make things easier, and that's how I let it happen." I asked without malice, "Did you agree to appear in a video for the property company?" He nodded, miserable. Mara said it would pay later, that the work would come through, and then Argus happened and it all folded into one plan. He rubbed his face like a man who wants to push back a morning he regrets. "I didn't want to hurt you." I said what was true. "You wanted to avoid your own mistakes landing on your children. And I wanted to keep a roof over my head that I scrubbed myself." Those wishes collided. He looked at me then, properly, as if seeing I was not an obstacle, but a person with a calendar of her own. Mara stood a little apart, staring at the traffic. When she spoke, her voice was very low. "This will ruin us, May. The decorator is booked, the agent has a buyer, the deposit for Argus is gone now, and Daniel told his firm he could release equity by autumn." Her control had finally met a wall. I answered without spite. "Imagine that you planned a life around someone else's asset, and then that person said no." She exhaled once, sharp. "We'll be speaking to a solicitor." My solicitor, standing beside me, nodded pleasantly. "Please do." We turned to go and then stopped because another figure had appeared in the doorway, a man in his 30s with a shaved head and a blue fleece bearing the building society's logo. He looked at me with a small smile that I recognized from church and then addressed Mara with a steadier voice than his age suggested. "I'm here about the after-hours branch visit. The investigator will be in touch." He did not look at Daniel. He looked at me again and tipped his head. "Jay," he said softly, and tapped the paper bag in his hand. "The carrot cake at the cafe is better on Wednesdays." I stared and then laughed, the sound honest and not unkind, because the small note with the initial that had arrived on my mat had a body now and a job and a lunch break. He had seen enough to send a warning without putting his name on a line until it was safe. We walked away while the 4 o'clock slot behind us spilled out into the hallway with another family and their folder, and in my bag the lever my husband left had done its work. I did not feel triumphant. I felt appropriately heavy and clear. The next steps were mine. When the silence in the notary's office finally settled, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself to breathe. My daughter and her husband looked like statues, their faces drained of color, their plans scattered like broken glass. The documents were on the table for everyone to see: my late husband's will, the property deed in my name, and the transfer of funds that had been quietly arranged years ago. The lawyer's words had been clear and precise, leaving no room for manipulation. I was not the helpless widow they thought they could corner. I was the legal owner of everything they had tried to seize, and I had the proof in black and white. Amanda's voice finally cracked through the tension. "Mother, you can't mean to leave us with nothing. You know we've built our lives around the expectation of this house, of the accounts. What are we supposed to do now?" Her tone was no longer arrogant, but pleading, yet there was no trace of remorse, only fear of losing what she thought she was owed. Chad stood beside her, silent but fuming, his jaw tight as if one wrong word might shatter what little control he had left. I looked at them calmly, not with anger but with a weight that came from years of sacrifice they had chosen to forget. What you built your lives around was not love or respect for me, it was greed. You both showed me exactly how much I mattered when you threw me out of your home with 2 suitcases. Today, you are only facing the truth that should have been obvious from the beginning: you cannot live on what was never yours. The lawyer cleared his throat and explained the practicalities again. Amanda and Chad had no legal claim, and any attempt to contest the will would expose the documents they themselves had signed, papers Chad had pushed in front of me, thinking I was too naive to understand. Instead, those papers revealed his intent to pressure me into handing over control, a move that now stood as evidence of attempted coercion. The irony was that in trying to secure everything, he had provided the clearest proof against himself. Leaving the office, I felt the eyes of others on me. People in the lobby who had overheard parts of the argument whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of pity for me and disgust at the younger couple who had spoken so harshly to their own mother. That social weight, the quiet judgment of the community, pressed harder on Amanda and Chad than anything I could have said. They lowered their heads, suddenly so small in front of people whose opinions they had always valued more than mine. Back at my modest apartment, I sat by the window and poured myself tea. The room was silent, but for the first time in many months, it was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of peace. My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor, a kind woman who had seen me return. I heard what happened. "If you ever need company, my door is open." That simple kindness meant more to me than all the empty words Amanda had given in the past year. In the weeks that followed, I began to put my life back together on my own terms. I met with a local volunteer group that organized tutoring for children whose parents worked long hours. They welcomed me immediately, grateful for the patience and steadiness I could bring. For the first time in years, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money or family obligations. My contribution was valued, not exploited. Amanda tried to call a few times. The first attempts were angry, accusing me of betrayal, of choosing strangers over my own blood. The later calls softened into apologies, excuses about pressure and stress, but I recognized them for what they were, attempts to claw back what she had lost. I did not answer. I had already given her everything once, and she had shown me how little it meant to her. This time, the boundary was firm. As for Chad, I heard through neighbors that he had been forced to sell his car and take on extra work after losing the chance to secure the inheritance. His pride had taken the hardest blow, but that was his burden, not mine. The last image I had of him was in that office, his face pale as the lawyer read the will aloud. That memory was enough. One evening, as I walked home from the tutoring center, I passed by a bakery window and saw a young family laughing together over a shared pastry. For a moment, a pang of grief touched me, the reminder that I once dreamed of such simple warmth with my daughter. But then I reminded myself that I had not lost everything. I had reclaimed my dignity, my independence, and the ability to decide who truly deserved a place in my life. The story did not end with a grand reconciliation or a dramatic embrace. It ended with me standing tall, not waiting for anyone's permission to live. My daughter and her husband had taught me that being needed and being valued were not the same thing. What mattered now was that I finally knew the difference, and I would never again confuse the two. And so, when people ask me if I regret exposing them so publicly, I answer with honesty. No, because that was the moment I stopped being a burden and started being myself again.